So I'm going to introduce Katie Swanson, Catherine Swanson. She is a person with lived and living experience and various marginalized identities herself. She has an MPH, has worked in harm reduction with drug users, sex workers, and people dealing with serious mental health issues, and folks struggling with trauma, substance misuse, and compulsive behaviors. She's been doing this for over 25 years. She's been a tireless advocate and fighter for harm reduction. She is the co-founder of the hepatitis testing, education, and vaccination services at the Berkeley Free Clinic, of points of distribution 1 and 2, and the hotties of harm reduction. If y'all know about that, there, salute. All right. She's been doing this since 2016. Catherine has had the honor of being the principal consultant at the Balance of Imperfection, a nationally recognized harm reduction technical institute assistance firm, excuse me. And here we go, Catherine Swanson.
Oh, Catherine, I think you're muted. Sorry.
Yes.
I am muted. Thank you so much, Paul. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. So thank you so much, Hiawatha. Nice to see y'all. I am going to, can someone please let me share my screen, please? That'd be awesome.
I think you can. Let me just.
I cannot. Oh, it says disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, weird. I just made you co-host. So try that now.
Ah, there we go. Got it.
Okay, good.
Perfect. I'm just looking for my slides. Thank you so much for hanging for just a second. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and start these slides. Everybody can see. Are we good? Awesome.
Yes.
So this is my bona fides. It's a long list. I've been in harm reduction since the first National Harm Reduction Conference in 1996. And I've done a bunch of stuff. Right now, I'm a consultant. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to define what a peer is, because there's always some confusion and some mismatching around what exactly what we mean by peer. We're going to look at different roles for peers in low threshold programs, learn about rolling with resistance when it comes to dealing with issues around peers, talk about the continuum of involvement for peers, the logistics of hiring peers, and preparing your organization to accept peers, and finally talk a little bit about the best practices according to various people in harm reduction for working with peers, including my own experience. I'd like to acknowledge and give a shout out to the peers that I've had the honor of working, collaborating, scheming, and fighting with these past 25 years, most especially the person pictured here, a dude named John Paul Hammond, who doesn't get enough acknowledgement, I think, in the harm reduction community. He was a member of the founding member of the Harm Reduction Working Group, always making sure, tirelessly making sure that people who use drugs had a real voice at the table in the services that surrounded them. Sometimes even to the extent of jumping up on chairs and shouting about it. So peers help meet these principles of harm reduction, right? They ensure that drug users and those with a real history of drug use routinely have a real voice in the creation of the programs and policies designed to serve them. And having peers does make sure that drug users themselves are affirmed as the primary agents of change, which are both principles, the principles of harm reduction that I kind of wanted to highlight. No, oh, there we go. So I just want to say this because my lawyer told me to. Some of the stuff I'm going to talk to you about is about employment law, and I'm not a lawyer, so please do consult an employment attorney for your situation. That's super important. But I did write the Harm Reduction Hacks, which is a syringe service program and basic operations handbook. It was paid for by NASTAD and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. But what I did was I went out and I interviewed literally dozens of people who've worked in harm reduction, anywhere from very short periods of time. These are all people in leadership roles, to people who've been working in the movement for 30 years or more. So that is a resource that you can find for yourself at harmreductionhacks.org. Has more information about working with peers and some of the logistics of involving peers and why you might want to involve them in your organization. I see peer involvement as, essential to the work that we do. Peers are the people who are using your program. They're people who are actively using drugs, doing sex work, living unhoused, and or with mental illness right now. They're the embodiment of nothing about us without us. They are the us in that sentence, right? And they are the experts, right? So peers versus people with lived experience, we hear these terms sort of bandied around a lot. And I want to be really clear that people with lived experience are very important to programs, absolutely. Not saying that they aren't, but they're not peers. It's not the same thing. Peers are people who are actively using at the level of the folks you're trying to reach. There are people who are actively unhoused. There are people who are currently doing sex work, people currently dealing with their own MAT recovery process. They're not people who've been in recovery for more than 6 months or several years. They're not people who used to be in the life. They're people who are in the life right now. And I think that that distinction is super important because things change so quickly that people who used to be peers or people who used to be in the life don't have the same experiences as folks who are currently there. So just want to put that out there and sort of like frame us where we are. Peers are the people who are currently using your program. So the roles for peer and MAT and these sort of MAT programs include recruiting. I guarantee you that your peers know way more people who are using drugs right now than most of y'all do. So they're great for recruitment. They're awesome as community liaisons. They can provide peer support to people who are in your program. They provide a conduit for communication, community education, and they're community experts, and they will act in that role. And they can offer you insights into what folks in your community need that you will never gain if you do not have those folks in the room. So arguments for peers. The first and foremost important argument for peers is that they're the experts, right? The idea is the idea that like somehow like other people can come into a community and fix that community or save that community is an idea that's really born out of a very sort of like 19th century idea of missionary work. And it's just not true, right? People's and communities, we know that people are and communities move forward better, more effectively, if they have people who are actually a part of those communities as a part of those conversations, as a part of making the policies, as a part of creating the programs that serve them, right? Peers have greater expertise than most of us when it comes to the communities that they're from, the drug using communities that they're from. They certainly have more expertise than somebody with a degree who's never been in those communities, right? They have a moral authority that you can never achieve because you ain't been there. They help address structural violence. And by that, I mean the structural violence of poverty. You want to give these people jobs because honestly, they need money and you have it and you need to give it to them, right? That's a moral thing. And it does help address that structural issue of that structural violence that people are facing, that is poverty. It shows the community that you're committed to the work that's being done, and it gives you kind of a moral authority because you're like hiring people who are actually from the community, so people can see that you mean business, that you mean you're serious, that you're taking people seriously, and you're taking the community that you're serving seriously, right? It provides skills and they provide skills and experience that many clinicians, many people who like sort of like come at this from a graduate, school place just don't have. It strengthens and builds the community that you're trying to serve, which in turn provides the emotional support and buffering that people will often need in order to move forward with their recovery, whatever that looks like to them. And it gives peers esteem and a path to belonging to something that is out of that life that we're talking about. And moreover, like, and maybe the most important thing, and I'm not going to go on and on about the numbers because A, we don't have time, and B, that's not really my thing. Evidence supports their inclusion. Everybody across the board in public health, we know that involving people from the communities that we are serving improves the quality of the services that we are providing, whether we are talking about people who are doing, health education around diabetes, who are people from communities, I'm thinking about, sort of diabetes educators, people who are educating people about drugs, people who are educating people about all kinds of things. We know across the board that evidence supports the inclusion of people with living experience from communities that are being served. They create stronger programs, they create, programs that are much more responsive and better responsive to the needs of the actual community members. So when you, sorry about that. So you're going to meet some resistance when you start trying to include peers, especially if you're from a more traditional kind of structure where they're not necessarily included, or peers are viewed with some sort of disdain or distrust. And let's be honest, that's out there because of stigma around drugs and drug users, right? So the first thing you're going to need to do is accept people where they're at, and that includes your colleagues and yourself, because you may not be ready to face your own bias around these things, right? So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is you're going to need to recognize that stigma and bias are the basis for the resistance that you're feeling. And that's a very difficult thing to work through, but you're going to need to do that on a personal level. And that means really thinking about the stories that you've heard or things that you know about people who use drugs. Have reasonable answers to legitimate questions, because there are legitimate questions that people have about, like, well, what about this piece of hiring people who use drugs? And apply harm reduction to all things. Glenn Backus, who has been a lobbyist in harm reduction for a very long time, has advised me that, like, you have to apply harm reduction to all things and all people, even when it's very difficult. So what about other things? These are sort of like what I think about as the what about questions, right? I mean, these are the questions that people will often get in response to, well, what do you mean you want me to hire people who use drugs to be in this program? What if they use drugs? Is like the first question that people have. Like, what if they use drugs on the job? Is a big question that people have. Well, I'm here to tell you that you are already right now working with people who are habituated to substances and using them every single day, and you have no idea that that's happening, right? The only difference here is that these people will be honest about their drug use. That's the only real difference, right? Because, as I say, I guarantee you that you're already working with people who use drugs on a regular basis. Next question that comes up is, what if they fill in some shitty stigma about people who use drugs, that they lie, steal, or defraud others? These are all not true stigma, certainly not true in each individual case. And your organization, your workplace probably already has policies about lying, stealing, or trying to defraud your agency. You probably don't need new policies for that, because that's just not acceptable behavior. One of the things that John Paul taught me is that changing the rules to make them nicer for drug users is a way of patronizing drug users. So you just apply the same rules. It's no different. People can't lie on the job. They can't steal from your job. That's just a thing people can't do, right? What about boundaries with other community members? And this is a sticky subject, and one that's actually like that there's some rational concern there, because there are a lot of like role things that come up with peers, like the differentiation between being, a quasi professional and a mentor, and sort of a mentor in a leadership role as a peer, and being just a friend. Right. And so the thing to do about that is to be really transparent and have those discussions openly and honestly with your peers, because it is like, it can be confusing for anybody, because, like, am I this person's friend? Am I a professional? What capacity am I dealing with this person? And it can get really sticky. And so it's super important to be transparent about those issues. Another thing that comes up is what about drug-free workplace pledges? I will just point out that nowhere under the drug-free, like federal drug-free workplace pledge, does it say that you have to drug test anybody. So there you go. You can just move forward. What about our liability? I think that like liability concerns are based on, well, I was looking it up. It's like the reasonable expectation. And when people are doing illegal things, that's beyond the scope of a reasonable expectation. You prepare for people doing illegal things. So you're sort of off the hook liability wise there. Again, talk to a lawyer about that particular piece, but that's my general understanding of how that works, is that you're not particularly liable if somebody's committing a crime, right? As most people who use drugs unfortunately are. What about hiring contractors? We'll talk about that in some more detail in just a minute. And what if they're flaky? Well, this is a real concern, like, because people who are using drugs chaotically oftentimes are, they're emotionally in chaos a lot. And so concentrating on responsibilities is very difficult. And that's a real thing. So you try to make that employment for them, their involvement, as low threshold, and a place where and a place where they can, sorry, I just got distracted by the chat. Where they can drop in and out as they need to. One of the things that's very interesting is that you find that the longer that your peers are with you, the less flaky they tend to become as they themselves become more stable. And part of their stability is oftentimes like having like a real thing to do with their time other than, only being invested in the life. So what is the continuum of involvement? We have contractors, hourly employees, and salaried employees is kind of the continuum of peer involvement. Contractors, and I looked up New York state law just to like be clear, it's a lot like other state laws that I'm familiar with. Contractors have to be treated very carefully. They can't have set hours. They can't get equipment, tools, or supplies. They cannot be supervised in a traditional way, which doesn't mean that you can't have work product demands. You can't say, we need this to happen in order for us to give you money. That's totally fine. But you can't tell them how to do it, right? You can't approve their work product before, and you can't require them to get approval or coverage for any kind of time off. Contractors have to pay their own taxes. And you have to have an agreement or a contract in place with those people to make sure that your agency is covered. The pros for contractors are that it's a lot more successful for people who are super chaotic. It's also less stressful for staff because they're not, charged with supervising these people. Contractors in positions often do things like they'll recruit new people, they'll like come to meetings, they'll provide their sort of like internal expertise on what the community needs, but they won't necessarily be beholden in the same way that an employee would. It can be hard to keep contractors engaged, and you'll need a justification or some kind of a workaround. One of the projects that I work on actually utilizes my company as a pass-through. So I actually am the one paying the contractors, which has worked out really nicely for us. And I believe for our peers, one of whom is on the call today. Hey, Kat. So hourly employees are subject to employment laws and rights. They're more flexible than salaried employees. The pros are that they're more flexible. They provide employees with more work history, more community focused. It's oftentimes a stepping stone for other forms of employment, and they enjoy more rights and benefits for employees that contractors don't. Right. The cons are that they require more supervision, more rigid than contract employees, and not as suitable for really chaotic people or people who are really struggling. So that It's another thing. Then salaried employees are the most rigid, as most of you who may be on salary know. They usually are in more outward facing, sort of like leadership positions, professional roles that usually require some kind of a degree or at least a fair amount of prior experience. Representation matters, and it's really inspiring for people to see peers in leadership roles. Peers in leadership roles have a deep moral authority and authenticity that nobody else can achieve. The cons, it can be extremely stressful, and transparency and boundaries are absolutely essential. A lot of times people who are peers who then go on to become salaried in leadership positions get really burned out because they can never stop working. And I know I'm looking at some of you in this room. That's just the truth of it. So it's really important to be like really clear and honest about the sort of necessity of boundaries and transparency and all that. So what are the logistics? The first thing I'm going to talk about is like boundaries and transparency. Boundaries include personal boundaries as well as organizational boundaries. So it's important that peers understand what it means, when they're acting as a peer for the project that they're working on, and when they're being a friend. You guys need to be super clear about what the boundaries are for your organization, about what peers are supposed to be doing and what they're not supposed to be doing. And these boundaries should apply to everyone associated with the organization. They should be talked about openly. And it's super important, again, to establish the difference between being a peer and being a friend. Transparency includes in hiring practices, expectations, procedures, policy, and how mistakes are handled. Those things build trust and community. And that's true across the board, whether you're talking about peers or any other aspect of your organization. That's how you build trust and community in your organization. And it's essential for working with traumatized folks, because those of us who, are pushing the boundaries of the ACE scores can tell you that we don't trust people very easily. And so if you are not transparent about this stuff, we will suspect that you are being shady in some way, and you will never develop the rapport that you need with us. So you need to prepare your organization, which means starting internally, like addressing stigma and confronting bias, both within yourself and within the organization. How is the organization set up? How do people talk about people who use drugs? One of the projects that I've worked on, I was gobsmacked to hear this I felt like I was talking to somebody from the 80s, because they kept talking about the addicts and how the addicts all steal and stuff like that. If your organization is at a point where that's how you talk about people who use drugs, you cannot have peers. You need to start there. So define your terms, define what you want out of peers, who peers are going to be, their roles are they're going to fulfill. The most important thing for these folks is that they're reliable and enthusiastic. And it's also super important that you're pulling peers in because they're reliable, talented, and enthusiastic, and not just because they check some box, right? Being a token is a terrible feeling, and people resent it very, very much. And they can tell, don't think you're cute. Don't think you're slick. Don't think any of that. You have to understand that you're either, having these people in the room because they have something to share or not, and you respect them as a professional or not. Right. So let's see. In terms of logistics, and I'm going very, very fast because we don't have a lot of time, unfortunately, for this. You need to talk to, if you're talking about contractors, you need to figure out if you can have contractors. You need to talk to a CPA or a tax attorney. The criteria that I read to you before about not supervising people, not providing them with equipment, that is actually something that I read on the New York tax people side. I forget what your tax organization branch is for your government, but from the New York's tax website, this is a classic criteria for who contractors are in a lot of states. You need to document the difference between, and how your peers, if you're hiring contractors, how your peers don't meet the criteria as employees. That's super important. And make sure that you have a contract in place for them. And instruct your peers on tax filing and the limitations of their role, right? So that's for contractors. For employees, normal hiring procedures, make sure to go over policies and procedures. And one of the logistical things is to check your insurance policy and check your carrier to make sure that they have robust SUD and behavioral health coverage. So if your peers need to access those things, they can do through your in-house insurance. In terms of best practices, expect to train all of your peers and actually everyone in your organization, but peers in particular, expect to train them personally, informally, and in short doses. That usually works best for folks. Be open to learning from them. This is a praxis situation. This is not I'm the expert and you have something to learn from me situation. You always have something to learn from these folks. And they often have a high degree of information that may not be available to you otherwise. Where possible, have varying levels of involvement or employment, and allow people to go in and out of those levels of involvement as much as possible. Keep clear boundaries. Professional expectations must apply to everyone. And don't create policies that set peers up for failure. Think about how your policies may be biased in terms of class and race. And, professionalism is a kind of classism, right? I mean, if we're going to be honest about that, right? And so if your professional expectations of people are something that they can't meet because that's just not the culture that they come from, you're setting them up for failure. So it's one of the things that you need to examine and make sure that you're prepared to deal with, because people have different expectations about how you talk to people and what's okay to talk to people about and things like that. And so you need to be clear about that kind of thing beforehand so that you're not setting folks up for failure based on your cultural expectations of how everyone's supposed to be. Well, everyone's not like that. And a lot of people who come from less formal cultural backgrounds, it may not sit with them the same way that you expect it to, right? Other best practices: train for redundancy, make sure that things can be covered by multiple people, work with people's schedules. Do not schedule 8 o'clock in the morning meetings for people who use drugs. They're not going to be there. It will not happen, right? 90% of the time. And I'm not saying that they can't be there, but I'm saying that people, especially people who are in chaotic use, morning is not their best time. So don't do that to them, right? Work with their schedules as much as possible. Allow people to come and go. Like I said, pay people in a way that works for them. That means if they don't have a bank account, you need to figure out ways to pay people who are unbanked, right? Highly shout out to Venmo, which allows people to utilize the money in their Venmo account without having a bank. So consider piecework. That means consider, having discrete pieces of work that people can do on a contract basis. That allows people to again, do as much or as little as they can in any given day. And hold people with love and respect no matter how chaotic they get. And again, these are best practices that I learned just from my own experiences, but also from having talked to dozens of harm reduction leaders over the years. So with that, we're at question and answer. So I'm just going to stop there. Hiawatha, do you have anything to add? Because I was telling Hiawatha the other day, I feel some kind of way about acting like I'm the only expert in the room. Kat, as well, if y'all could step up and share if you have anything.
No, the only thing that I wanted to add real quick is that there's so many job titles that individuals with lived and living experience and or peers can have. So it's not just limited to the list. And people at number one, number two, also people need to be treated with dignity and respect all the way throughout the process. And a lot of things that was important here is check your biases at the door. We all have them. Please recognize that we have biases and or that you have biases, and they may come up especially when it comes to the drug user community. and marginalized community. Also, buy-in has to come from high up, from the leaders of the organization. If you don't have buy-in from high up, no matter what you try to implement, it's not going to flow all the way through the organization. It has to flow all the way through the organization. And please, a livable wage. People need to be paid a livable wage. They don't need to be just given something to be given something. They need to be honestly paid their value, their worth, which probably won't never happen, but they need to be paid a livable wage. And I'll just leave it there. But there's one question that didn't come out the chat that I have that I want you to answer, if you could, real quick. And that is, if you had to ask anyone from one of these agencies or all of these agencies a request of them when it comes to implementing peers into their said establishment, what would that be?
Run that by me one more time, Hiawatha.
If you had a request or if you had a request for people hiring peers, there's something that you wanted them to know, what would that be besides what you said on the presentation?
I mean, check your biases and pay people. I mean, those are two things, but those are the best things.
Okay.
And pay people what they're worth, right? I mean, I think that's key. And when I talk about like hiring contractors, I want to be clear that you need to compensate people fairly for their time, right? You're not paying people by the hour, but you need to pay people a reasonable amount of money so that, you know, that they're doing this for a reason and not just because you think it's cute to have somebody tick a box on your grant application.
Yes, and when you're working with other folks, ensure that those folks know that you have peers and that they are also treating them with dignity and respect. When you have MOUs with other folks and you have peers going to that said entity or co-working with, collaborating with other said folks, make sure that they are being treated with dignity and respect all the way across the board by your contractors, subcontractors, and people that you may be having agreement with to do work with.
I mean, Mary, to your point, Mary is asking, I have worked with folks who have lived and living experience who prefer not to use the term peer to describe their work because it automatically discloses their experience.
Yes.
I heard, you know, Mary, like there's a lot of reasons not to be out about being a person with living experience. And I think that the deal is that like, what do they want? What title do they want? That's all. I mean, that's simple.
But
Right.
but then it's also the fact that it separates between staff, because staff and employee, because sometimes within their own organization, you have people that feel like, oh, you're just a peer, but
Right.
you're employed next to them and you're doing almost the same work, and in some cases the same work as other folks, but by labeling them as a peer, now they're othered and they're treated in other ways and singled out, instead of just being treated as someone with dignity and respect, and as someone who is capable of doing that said task. So the singling out, the othering is what most of the time what people are talking about. So if there's other titles, if they're doing case management, then guess what? They're not a peer case manager, they're a case manager.
Yep. Exactly. Kat, did you want to add anything? Or you still here with us?
I mean, you guys pretty much covered all of it. I really appreciated what you just had to say right now. Yeah, because I mean, it's hard when you are doing the same job as people sometimes and not getting the same, not getting the same respect, but also just not anywhere near like the same levels, you know, and sometimes it's really frustrating when that happens, because we have more experience and more like clout with the participants. Like they are going to go talk to us before they're going to talk to you guys. Like even if you are the case manager, you know, like just and you know, it's just important to respect that and to acknowledge, like, you know, that I can't think of the word, but acknowledge that, you know, yeah.
I think another thing that has come up with your experiences, like, and we've talked about this, like on the side, is like people kind of like you also need to be very careful about like acknowledging the ideas and experience of people who use drugs who happen to be in the room as, you know, as experts, and not steal their ideas and run with them yourself.
Yeah.
Because that kind of like, that is, I've seen that happen to peers, and it certainly happened to Kat, where people have run with her ideas, as their own, which, you know, you feel some kind of way when somebody does that and they're making 6 times as much money as you.
Yes.
So any other
Any other
questions,
questions?
thoughts? Again, I'm not a lawyer. I just like to put that out there because my brother-in-law made me. He's a lawyer. And I'll leave you with this thought. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Super important. And these 2 resources, the harm reduction hacks. And if you haven't seen it, Terry Morris's fabulous harm reduction library are both 2 excellent resources with great information about peers and peer involvement. So go ahead and take a look at those.